They called her Grandma behind her back. Sometimes, when he was feeling particularly cruel, Dr. Preston Sterling would call her Dusty, not knowing it was a name she had once worn with honor. At Metropolitan Trauma Center, it was just another insult, a reference to her being old, slow, and probably gathering dust in a corner. Sterling, the boy wonder chief of surgery with a jawline from a magazine and an ego forged in the fires of nepotism, actually placed a $500 bet in the residence lounge. He bet that Sarah Miller, the new floor nurse with the quiet voice and the hands that never quite stopped shaking, wouldn't last a month. The security camera footage from that Tuesday night would later show the exact moment the world split in two. 1 second, it was just another shift in a high-stress environment, the fluorescent lights humming with an aggressive, sterile brightness. The next, it was chaos incarnate, a storm of olive drab and screaming sirens that descended upon them without warning. They took her ID badge, handed her a flimsy cardboard box filled with the sad, meager contents of her locker, and told her she was finished. After 25 years of saving lives in places that would make a seasoned cop have nightmares, Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Miller, retired, was fired for assaulting a doctor while saving a man's life. She stood on a street corner in the freezing Chicago rain, clutching that soggy box, and thought her life was well and truly over. She was wrong. The cavalry was coming, and they weren't coming for the doctor. Check the expiration dates again, Sarah. Dr. Preston Sterling's voice was a smooth, condescending balm that slicked across the tense quiet of the trauma bay. He didn't look at her, his attention fixed on the reflection of his perfectly coiffed hair in the polished steel of a supply cabinet. He smoothed his pristine white coat, a garment that seemed more like a ceremonial robe than a piece of workwear. Sarah Miller, her small 5'3" frame swallowed by oversized blue scrubs, didn't sigh. She didn't roll her eyes. She simply nodded, her graying hair pulled back into a severe, unfashionable bun. "I checked them 10 minutes ago, Doctor." Her voice was low, raspy, as if worn down by years of shouting over the noise of things far louder than hospital monitors. "And now you'll check them again," Sterling said, finally turning to face her. He gave the 2 junior nurses, Brittany and Jessica, a conspiratorial wink. They giggled, a sound that grated on the ears of Brenda O'Brien, the charge nurse, who watched the exchange from her station with undisguised contempt. "We can't have our patients coding because Grandma forgot how to read a label. It's a simple matter of protocol. Patient safety first." The insult, wrapped in the sanctimonious language of hospital policy, was his signature. He loved an audience. He gestured toward the crash cart, a silent, imperious command. The faint, rhythmic tremor in Sarah's hands was more pronounced as she reached for the drawer. It was a legacy of a dusty afternoon in Kandahar, of 6 straight hours holding manual pressure on a young ranger's femoral artery after an IED strike, her own body riddled with shrapnel. The nerve damage was permanent. To Sterling, it was a sign of incompetence, of age, of a geriatric nurse who had no business in the fast-paced, high-stakes world of a Level 1 trauma center. Brenda watched Sarah move with that deliberate, plodding pace that drove the residents insane. They saw slowness. Brenda, a veteran of 20 years in this very ER, saw methodical precision. She saw a woman who never missed a detail, whose charts were immaculate, who seemed to anticipate a patient's needs seconds before the monitors did. But Brenda had also survived decades of hospital politics by knowing which battles to fight. A senator's son who was also the chief of surgery at 34 was not a winnable battle. So she stayed silent, her jaw tight. Sarah pulled out a tray of intubation drugs. Her fingers, though trembling, moved with an unnerving grace as she turned over each vial, her eyes scanning the tiny print. Succinylcholine, rocuronium, etomidate, all well within date. She had known they would be. This wasn't about patient safety. It was a power play, a daily ritual of humiliation designed to remind everyone in the room of their place in the hierarchy he so cherished. "Satisfied, Doctor?" Sarah asked, her voice devoid of inflection. Sterling smirked, a flash of perfect white teeth. "For now. Try to keep up, will you? We're not running a retirement home here." He turned and strode away, his entourage of fawning residents trailing in his wake like pilot fish. Brittany Moore, the younger nurse, had the decency to look slightly ashamed. She avoided Sarah's eyes, busying herself with restocking gauze. She was new, eager to please, and terrified of Sterling. Aligning with the quiet, shaky old nurse was career suicide. "Don't mind him," Brenda grumbled, walking over to Sarah. "He's an arrogant little prick who thinks a Harvard degree makes him a god. He wouldn't know a real doctor if one bit him on his perfectly sculpted ass." Sarah offered a small, tired smile. "It's fine, Brenda. I'm just here to do my job." She placed the drug tray back in the cart, the click of the latch echoing in the sudden quiet. She was just trying to get through the next few years, to protect the pension she desperately needed to survive. She'd come here to Chicago seeking peace, an escape from the ghosts that haunted her nightmares, a quiet, anonymous life where she could heal people without the constant threat of violence. She wanted to be a nurse, not a soldier. Not anymore. Big Mike Washington, the night shift security guard, ambled over with 2 cups of coffee from the machine. He was a mountain of a man, a former college football player whose gentleness was as immense as his frame. He handed one to Brenda and the other to Sarah. "Don't let that peacock get to you, Sarah," he said in his deep, rumbling voice. "Heard him talking to one of the board members on the phone yesterday. Name-dropped his father, the senator, 3 times in 2 minutes. All sizzle, no steak, that one." "Thanks, Mike," Sarah said, the warmth of the cup a small comfort against the chill of the air conditioning and the deeper chill of the constant condescension. She took a sip. It was terrible, burnt coffee, but it was an act of kindness, and that meant more than anything. The rest of the shift simmered with the usual low-grade tension. Sterling would periodically storm through the ER, finding fault in everything, his voice booming as he corrected a resident's suture technique or berated a nurse for being 2 seconds late with a lab draw. He treated the nursing staff like servants and the residents like serfs, all while maintaining a veneer of polished, charming professionalism for any administrator who happened to walk by. Sarah just kept her head down. She moved from bed to bed, her movements slow but efficient. She soothed a frightened child with a broken arm, cleaned up an intoxicated homeless man without a hint of judgment, and held the hand of an elderly woman whose husband had just passed away in the ICU. She was a ghost, a quiet presence that most of the staff had already learned to ignore. A piece of old, outdated furniture in Sterling's shiny, modern kingdom. She was just finishing up a chart when Dr. David Park, a first-year resident with kind eyes and a perpetual look of terror, approached her hesitantly. "Nurse Miller?" "It's Sarah," she corrected gently. "Sarah, I was looking at Mr. Henderson's EKG in Bay 4. I think I see some ST elevation in the inferior leads, but Dr. Sterling said it was just benign early repolarization and to focus on his gallbladder." Sarah's eyes flicked up from the chart. That faint tremor in her hands stilled for a moment. She walked with Park over to the monitor. She looked at the jagged green lines, her gaze intense. She saw it instantly. It was subtle, but it was there. A tombstone pattern forming. The man was having a massive heart attack. Sterling, in his haste to diagnose a more surgically interesting problem, had missed it completely. "Get a full 12 lead, now," she said, her voice dropping into a lower register, the raspiness replaced by a hard, clear authority that made the young resident snap to attention. Page Cardiology, stat. Tell them we have a STEMI and we're activating the cath lab. Get him on oxygen and give him 324 milligrams of aspirin to chew. Go, now! Park didn't hesitate. He ran. The tone of her voice had cut through his fear of Sterling. It was the voice of absolute certainty. 10 minutes later, the cardiologist was confirming her diagnosis, and Mr. Henderson was on his way to the catheterization lab, his life saved. When Sterling found out, he didn't thank her. He cornered her by the nurse's station. "You went over my head," he hissed, his voice low and venomous. His handsome face was twisted into an ugly mask of fury. "You countermanded a direct order from the chief of surgery. You are a nurse. You do not make diagnoses. You do not activate the cath lab. Do you have any idea the liability you just exposed this hospital to?" "The patient was having a heart attack, doctor," Sarah stated calmly, meeting his gaze without flinching. "The patient was my responsibility," he seethed. "You got lucky. This time. Do something like that again, and I will see to it personally that you are not only fired, but that you never work as a nurse in this state again. Are we clear?" "Crystal," Sarah said, her voice flat. She turned and walked away, the weight of his threat settling on her shoulders. She had done the right thing. She had saved a man's life. And for that, she had earned the wrath of the most powerful man in the hospital. The $500 on her not lasting the month was starting to look like a very safe bet. If you're already hooked by this story of justice, go ahead and hit that like button right now. It really helps us share more stories of everyday heroes who refuse to back down. Now back to Sarah's story, because what happened next changed everything. The alarm didn't just ring, it screamed. It was a sound that cut through the normal cacophony of the ER, a brutal, piercing klaxon that signified the absolute worst-case scenario. It wasn't a code blue for a cardiac arrest or a code red for a fire. This was the one they drilled for, but prayed they never heard. "Code black, mass casualty incident, stand by for details." The voice over the intercom was tight, strained. The atmosphere in the Metropolitan Trauma Center shifted instantly. The low-level hum of activity evaporated, replaced by a deadly, focused silence. Brenda O'Brien was on her feet, her face a grim mask. "All right, people, you heard it. Clear the bays. All non-critical patients to the waiting area. Trauma team, assemble. Let's move." Sterling emerged from his office, already barking orders. "I want 3 ORs prepped and on standby. Get me anesthesia, now. Park, Reynolds, with me. Everyone else, you answer to me and only me. What's the source?" he yelled at the charge nurse. "Don't know yet," Brenda snapped back, her usual deference gone, replaced by the hardened authority of a crisis commander. "Just that it's military." The word hung in the air. Military. That meant high-velocity projectiles, blast injuries, the kind of devastating trauma that civilian hospitals rarely saw. Sarah felt a cold, familiar calm settle over her. The tremor in her hands vanished. Her movements, once so deliberate and slow, became fluid and economical. She wasn't restocking a crash cart now. She was preparing a battlefield. She began laying out supplies: chest tubes, large-bore IVs, tourniquets, decompression needles, with a speed and precision that made Brittany, the young nurse, stare in disbelief. "What are you doing?" Sterling barked at her. "I didn't give you an order." "You will," Sarah said without looking at him. "You'll need these." Before he could retort, the double doors of the ambulance bay burst open with explosive force. It wasn't paramedics who came through. It was a wall of men in tactical gear, their faces grim, weapons held at a low ready. They fanned out, securing the entrance, their movements sharp and practiced. Behind them, a team of military medics wheeled in a gurney, moving at a dead run. "We've got a Navy SEAL commander, multiple GSWs to the chest and abdomen, shrapnel wound to the neck," one of the medics screamed, his voice hoarse. 2 units of ONEG in the field. Pressure is 80 over palpation. Heart rate 140. He's circling the drain. They transferred the patient to the trauma bay table with a practiced heave. The man on the table was a giant, his muscular frame covered in blood and dirt. An oxygen mask was strapped to his face, but his breathing was shallow, ragged. His eyes were open, scanning the room with a terrifying, wild intensity. Sterling pushed his way to the front, the picture of a confident leader taking charge. "All right, I have it. Get me a chest film, stat. Let's get a central line in. I need a full trauma panel. Someone get pressure on that neck wound." He zeroed in on the most obvious injury, a nasty gash on the right side of the patient's neck that was welling with dark, venous blood. It was a superficial but visually dramatic wound. "Park, pack that wound. Reynolds, get me the ultrasound. I want to do a fast exam." Sarah's eyes weren't on the neck. They were on the patient's chest and his throat. She saw three things Sterling, in his frantic, textbook-driven assessment, had completely missed. First, the patient's trachea wasn't in the midline. It was deviated, pushed over to the left by nearly 3 centimeters. Second, the veins in his neck were distended, bulging like thick ropes against his skin. And third, when she placed a hand on his upper right chest, she felt a crackling sensation under the skin, like touching Rice Krispies. Subcutaneous emphysema, the classic undeniable signs of a tension pneumothorax. A collapsed lung was pumping air into his chest cavity with every desperate breath, building up pressure that was crushing his heart and his good lung. The neck wound was a distraction. This was the killer. He had seconds, not minutes. "Doctor," Sarah said, her voice sharp and clear, cutting through the noise. "Look at his neck. His trachea is deviated." Sterling waved a dismissive hand, his focus entirely on the bleeding. "It's swelling from the shrapnel. Pack the damn wound, Park." The monitor above the patient began to shriek. The oxygen saturation, already low, was plummeting. 85%, 80, 75. His lips were turning a dusky violet color. His eyes, which had been locked on the ceiling, began to roll back in his head. "Doctor, he's going to arrest," Sarah said, her voice rising, losing its quiet deference and gaining a hard, metallic edge. "He has a tension pneumothorax. We need to decompress his chest, now." "I am the chief of surgery in this room, and I will not be told how to do my job by a nurse," Sterling roared, his face flushed with anger and underneath it a flicker of panic. He was losing control. The situation was moving too fast. It wasn't following the neat flowcharts in his textbooks. "Now back off before I have you removed." The patient's heart rate on the monitor crashed. From a tachycardic 140, it dropped to 80, then 60, then 40. Bradycardia, the final prelude to cardiac arrest. That was it, the decision point. Her career versus his life, her oath versus his orders. It wasn't a choice, it was a reflex. Sarah didn't ask for permission again. She moved with a speed that seemed impossible for her small frame. She didn't run. She exploded from her position by the supply cart. In one fluid motion, she snatched a 14-gauge angiocath, a needle the size of a small nail, from the tray she had prepared. "Don't you dare!" Sterling screamed, reaching out to grab her. She never saw him coming, but she felt him. She dipped her left shoulder, not pushing him, but performing a tactical block, a move learned in a dusty Krav Maga training room in Fort Bragg. Her elbow connected solidly with his sternum, using his own momentum against him. Sterling stumbled backward with a grunt of pain and surprise, crashing into a rolling tray of instruments that clattered to the floor. The room went deathly silent, save for the dying beep of the monitor. Every eye was on her. The military medics, the residents, Brenda, Big Mike by the door. They all froze, watching as the quiet old nurse stood over the dying SEAL commander. Sarah ignored them all. She placed her left hand on the patient's chest, her fingers finding the landmarks with practiced ease. Second intercostal space, mid-clavicular line. It was a motion she had performed 100 times in the back of bucking helicopters and in muddy ditches under a hail of gunfire. Her hand, the one that always trembled, was now as steady as granite. She held the large needle like a dagger, aimed it perpendicular to the chest wall, and with a firm, controlled push, drove it into the patient's chest, just over the top of the third rib. Hiss. The sound was audible throughout the stunned room. It was the sound of trapped air under incredible pressure escaping the chest cavity. The patient's body convulsed on the table. His chest, which had been unnervingly still, rose with a deep, shuddering gasp. On the monitor, the numbers began to climb. Oxygen saturation, 70, 75, 85, 92, 98. The heart rate, which had flatlined to a single long tone, suddenly jumped back to a steady, rhythmic 80 beats per minute. The violet color of his lips faded to a healthy pink. Sarah secured the catheter with a piece of tape, her movements economical and precise. She stepped back from the table, peeling off her bloody gloves. She looked at Sterling, who was picking himself up off the floor, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated rage and humiliation. "He's stable," she said, her voice cold and flat. "For now. He still needs a chest tube and a trip to the operating room. Do your job, doctor." The silence in the room was finally broken by a weak, rasping voice from the trauma table. The SEAL commander's eyes were open again, clear and lucid. They weren't looking at the fancy doctor or the team of residents. They were locked on Sarah. He slowly, painfully, raised a shaking hand, not in a wave, but in a gesture so profound it sucked all the remaining air out of the room. He brought his hand to his brow in a formal, lingering salute. Then he spoke, his voice a raw whisper through the oxygen mask, a name that no one in that room could have possibly known. "Dusty," he rasped. "Knew they'd send the best. Thank you, Colonel." The room didn't just go quiet. It ceased to exist. Brenda O'Brien stared as if Sarah had just grown a second head. Brittany's hands flew to her mouth, her eyes wide with a dawning, terrifying understanding. Dr. Park's jaw was literally hanging open. The military medics lining the wall snapped to attention, their eyes fixed on Sarah with a look of pure, unadulterated reverence. Sterling, his face drained of all color, just stared. "What? What the hell just happened?" he stammered, his bravado shattered, revealing the panicked, incompetent man beneath. He looked from the saluting commander to the small, unassuming nurse. He didn't see an old woman with shaky hands anymore. He saw something else entirely, something he couldn't comprehend, something that terrified him. Incredible, right? If you want to see more stories where the underdog becomes the hero, subscribe to this channel right now and ring that notification bell. Also, comment below with your best guess about what happens to Dr. Sterling, because trust me, his downfall is going to be spectacular. Let's continue. 2 hours later, the patient, Commander Thorne, was stable in the surgical ICU. He'd had a chest tube placed and undergone surgery to repair the internal damage from the gunshot wounds. He was going to live. The credit, officially, went to Dr. Preston Sterling, who had masterfully stabilized a critically injured patient under extreme duress. That was the narrative Sterling was already spinning, his voice smooth and confident once more as he spoke to the hospital administrator, Harold Pemberton. They were in Pemberton's office, a space of plush leather chairs and a mahogany desk that smelled of money and fear. Sarah stood before them, alone. Sterling sat in a chair beside the desk, looking every bit the wronged victim. Pemberton, a man who sweated when the air conditioning was on, was wiping his forehead with a silk handkerchief. "This is an open and shut case of gross misconduct, Harold," Sterling said, his tone reasonable, almost regretful. Nurse Miller not only defied a direct order from her superior, she physically assaulted me in the middle of a trauma resuscitation. You saw the bruises on my chest. She then performed an unauthorized, invasive procedure that could have killed the patient. It was only by my swift intervention that we were able to correct her mistake and save him. It was a breathtaking lie, delivered with the casual ease of a man who had never faced consequences.
Pemberton looked at Sarah, his eyes pleading with her to make this easy.
Nurse Miller, do you have anything to say for yourself? Sarah's hands were shaking again, the adrenaline from the crisis having long since faded, leaving behind only exhaustion and the cold certainty of what was coming. She looked at her hands, then at the two men who held her fate. "The patient is stable, isn't he?" she asked, her voice quiet. "That is not the point," Sterling snapped. "The point is protocol, chain of command, patient safety. She is a liability, a loose cannon. I have residents, interns who look to me for guidance. What message does it send if a floor nurse can attack a physician and get away with it? She claims she was a colonel. It's clear she's suffering from some sort of delusion, perhaps PTSD. She's mentally unstable." Pemberton sighed, a sound of weary capitulation. His job wasn't to find the truth. It was to mitigate liability. A nurse assaulting the star surgeon, the son of a senator, was a lawsuit and a PR nightmare. The choice was simple. He slid a pre-printed letter across the polished desk. "Sarah, I'm afraid we have to terminate your employment, effective immediately. Your actions, regardless of the outcome, represent a flagrant disregard for hospital policy. We can't have that." Sarah looked at the letter. She didn't beg, she didn't argue. A part of her had known this was the price. She had made her peace with it the moment she reached for that needle. She simply nodded. "Fine." She stood, her small frame radiating a dignity that seemed to make the opulent office shrink around her. She looked directly at Sterling, her eyes clear. "When you check on him," she said, her voice steady, "will you tell Commander Thorne that you saved him?" Sterling's smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. "Security will escort you to your locker and then off the premises," Pemberton said quickly, eager for the confrontation to be over. The walk of shame was a blur. Big Mike Washington was the one assigned to escort her. His face was a thundercloud of helpless anger. "I'm sorry, Sarah," he mumbled as they walked down the hallway. "This isn't right. I told Pemberton what I saw. Brenda told him. The medics told him. They don't care." "It's okay, Mike," she said, placing a hand on his arm. "You watch that blood pressure of yours." The other nurses wouldn't meet her eyes. They knew. They knew what had really happened, and they knew that if they spoke up, they'd be next. Fear was a powerful sedative. At her locker, she packed her things into a cardboard box. It didn't take long. A cracked coffee mug that said, "World's Okayest Nurse." A well-worn stethoscope she'd bought with her own money. A small, dying, succulent plant. And at the bottom, a framed photograph of her late husband, a handsome man in a crisp army dress uniform. 2 decades of service, both in and out of uniform, reduced to a box that wouldn't even fill the passenger seat of a car. Big Mike walked her to the main entrance. The automatic doors slid open with a soft whoosh, revealing a city weeping a cold, miserable October rain. "Take care of yourself," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Sarah stepped out into the downpour. The doors slid shut behind her. It was over. Not an angry thought, just a heavy, suffocating fact. Maybe she should have just let Sterling handle it. Maybe she was just an old, stubborn nurse who didn't know her place anymore. He'll press charges, she thought. There will be a police report. I'll lose my certification. I'll end up greeting customers at a grocery store. No one will ever know what this tired old lady once did. She stood on the corner, the rain plastering her graying hair to her forehead, soaking through her thin coat. The cardboard box grew heavier. its corners softening in the deluge. She clutched it to her chest, trying to shield the photo of her husband. Her bad knee, a souvenir from a mortar blast in Kandahar, began to throb in a dull rhythm. She looked at her reflection in the glass of a bus shelter. Just a tired, wet old woman, fired and alone. Then she heard it. At first, it was just a low thrumming, a vibration she felt more in her teeth than her ears, a sound that cut through the steady drumming of the rain. It grew louder, a deep, rhythmic thwop, 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 that was profoundly out of place in the urban landscape of downtown Chicago. Puddles on the street began to ripple. The glass of the bus shelter vibrated against her back. The ground itself seemed to shake. Pedestrians scattered, screaming, pointing up at the sky, assuming it was a terrorist attack. The sound grew into a deafening roar that pressed against her chest, the air pressure changing so fast her ears popped. Through the grey, swirling clouds, two shapes descended. Two UH-60 Black Hawk helicopters, their navigation lights flashing, tearing the night apart. They weren't heading for a helipad. With impossible precision, one of them landed directly in the middle of the intersection in front of the hospital, its powerful downdraft inverting umbrellas and sending trash cans rolling down the street. Tires screeched as a motorcade of black SUVs and olive-drab military Humvees came storming down the street from the opposite direction, blocking all traffic. Doors flew open, and soldiers in full combat gear poured out, establishing a perimeter with tactical efficiency. Red and blue police lights joined the chaos, creating a blinding, disorienting strobe effect in the gloom. Sarah just stood there, clutching her box, a forgotten relic in the middle of an invasion. News crews, appearing as if from thin air, began setting up cameras. A crowd was gathering, phones held aloft, recording the unbelievable spectacle. One of the soldiers, scanning the crowd, pointed directly at her. "Target in the rear!" he yelled into his radio. Another soldier broke from the line and sprinted through the gridlocked traffic, dodging cars, his boots splashing through the deep puddles. He ran straight for her. "Ma'am!" he shouted, his voice urgent. "Colonel Miller! You need to come with us, now!" He grabbed her arm with a firm, desperate grip. "Drop the box, ma'am. We have to go." "No," Sarah said, her voice barely a whisper. "The box comes with me." Before he could argue, the rear door of the lead SUV opened. A figure emerged, stepping out into the pouring rain as if it didn't dare touch him. He was an older man, tall and lean, wearing a simple windbreak, but he moved with an unmistakable aura of command. Flanking him were two men in dark suits, the telltale wires of the Secret Service visible in their ears. The man walked directly toward her, his path cleared by the soldiers. He stopped a few feet away, his eyes, the color of chips of ice, taking in her soaked appearance, the pathetic cardboard box, the look of utter defeat on her face. Then he spoke, his voice calm and measured, yet carrying an authority that silenced the chaos around them. "You're a hard woman to track down, Dusty." Sarah looked up at the familiar face of General Thomas Crenshaw, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a man she had pulled out of a burning Humvee in Fallujah 15 years ago. "You look like hell, Tom," she rasped. He allowed himself a small, grim smile. "So do you. Now, let's go fix this. I was watching the press conference. Time to correct the record." Inside the hospital, Dr. Preston Sterling was standing in the main lobby, in front of a hastily assembled podium and a bank of news cameras. He was the hero of the hour. He had just finished explaining, with practiced sincerity, how he had single-handedly saved the life of a decorated American hero. "And while our thoughts and prayers are with the commander and his family," he said, his voice resonating with false humility, "I also have to address a difficult internal matter. The nurse involved in the initial response, a temporary hire, unfortunately suffered what appears to be a severe psychological break under pressure. She acted erratically, endangering the patient, and had to be restrained and removed. We are ensuring she gets the help she needs. He was painting her as mentally unstable, a classic move to discredit a whistleblower. He was cementing his legacy, burying hers forever.
It was at that exact moment that General Crenshaw walked through the main doors, flanked by his security detail and a phalanx of grim-faced soldiers. The lobby fell silent. Cameras swiveled away from Sterling, the reporters sensing a much bigger story. Sterling's confident smile froze on his face. He recognized the 4 silver stars on the general's shoulders. Harold Pemberton, standing beside him, began to sweat profusely, his face turning a pasty white. The general didn't even glance at them. His eyes scanned the lobby until he saw Brenda O'Brien and Big Mike Washington standing near the back. "Where is she?" he commanded. "They fired her," Brenda said, her voice shaking with righteous anger. "They threw her out in the rain." Crenshaw's jaw tightened. He turned his icy gaze on Sterling. "You," he said, his voice dangerously quiet. "You just told the nation that one of my people was fired for instability." Sterling puffed out his chest, trying to reclaim his authority. "General, with all due respect, this is a hospital matter. That nurse is a danger to patients. I am the chief of surgery here, and I don't want the doctor," Crenshaw interrupted, his voice like cracking ice. "I want the nurse." He took a step closer, his presence seeming to fill the entire cavernous lobby. "I've reviewed the telemetry data from Commander Thorne's transport. I've spoken to my medics, and I've seen the security footage from your trauma bay." He gestured to an aide, who stepped forward holding a tablet. On the screen was crystal clear video of the entire resuscitation. It showed Sterling focusing on the neck wound. It showed Sarah's warnings being ignored. It showed the patient crashing. It showed Sarah blocking Sterling and plunging the needle into the commander's chest. It showed the immediate, miraculous result on the vital signs monitor. A first-year combat medic in a muddy ditch in the Hindu Kush Mountains would have spotted that tension pneumothorax, the general said, his voice a low, controlled roar. "When this woman, this nurse, attempted to save a man's life, a man whose life you were actively letting slip away, you tried to stop her. And when she saved him anyway, you had her fired and slandered her on national television." Sterling's face had gone from red to white. He began to stammer. That's not what happened. The footage is misleading. She assaulted me." Crenshaw ignored him, his focus absolute. He opened a classified black folder his aide handed him. "Do you know who Sarah Miller is?" he asked the silent, captivated room. He didn't wait for an answer. He began to read, his voice ringing with the weight of history. "Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Miller, retired, United States Army Medical Corps. 25 years of service, 6 tours in Iraq, 4 in Afghanistan. Lead trauma surgeon for a Joint Special Operations Command task force for a decade. Recipient of the Silver Star, the Bronze Star with Valor, and 2 Purple Hearts." He paused, letting the words sink in. The entire lobby was motionless. "They call her Dusty because for 10 years, if one of our operators went down anywhere on the planet, she was the one on the helicopter going in to get them, no matter the risk. That tremor in her hands you mocked?" He looked directly at Sterling, his eyes burning with contempt. "Nerve damage. From holding direct pressure on a soldier's severed femoral artery for 6 continuous hours after an IED strike. Refusing evacuation for herself until another medic could take over. That slow walk you made fun of, a shattered knee from a mortar blast in Kandahar, an injury she sustained while shielding a wounded Marine with her own body." He snapped the folder shut. The sound was like a gunshot. "You didn't fire a nurse," General Crenshaw said, his voice dropping to a deadly whisper. "You fired a living legend. And you did it to cover up your own catastrophic incompetence."
Sterling stood there, crumbling. The polished, handsome veneer had shattered completely, revealing the terrified, fraudulent child underneath. His mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. His father, the senator, couldn't help him now. No amount of money or influence could stand against the raw, undeniable truth that was crashing down upon him.
The general turned to the ashen-faced Harold Pemberton.
"Mr. Pemberton," he said, his tone final. "Effective immediately, this hospital's federal funding and its military trauma partnership are under review, pending a full investigation into your hiring practices, your quality of care, and what appears to be a decade of insurance fraud we've just uncovered during our preliminary background check on your institution. I suggest you start updating your resume." Pemberton looked like he was about to faint. He immediately turned on Sterling, his instinct for self-preservation absolute. "Dr. Sterling," he squeaked, pulling a letter from his jacket pocket that had clearly been pre-written for just such an emergency. "Effective immediately, your privileges are suspended. The board has voted to terminate your contract pending a federal investigation. You are to vacate the premises immediately." It was the swiftest, most complete betrayal imaginable. As reporters shouted questions and cameras flashed, a figure stepped forward from the crowd. It was Big Mike Washington. He walked right up to the stunned, broken form of Preston Sterling. In his hands, he held an empty cardboard box. He held it out. "I believe you know the way out, Dr. Sterling," Big Mike said, his deep voice resonating with the grim satisfaction of karma delivered. "Here's a box for your things. It's a bit small, but I'm sure you'll manage." Sterling stared at the box as if it were a venomous snake. He stumbled out into the pouring rain, without an umbrella, without a car waiting, without a friend in the world. The cameras followed him, their flashes illuminating his pathetic, rain-soaked exit. From the door of the SUV, Sarah watched it all. She said nothing. She just held her own box, the contents of which now seemed priceless. 1 year later, the sun shone brightly on the dedication ceremony for the new Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Dusty Miller Center for Pediatric and Military Trauma at Metropolitan General Hospital. The name had been changed, the administration completely overhauled. In the front row, General Crenshaw sat smiling. Beside him sat Commander Thorne, looking healthy and strong, a faint scar on his neck his only reminder of that night. The new chief of surgery, a humble and deeply respectful woman, watched from the side. The entire nursing staff, including Brenda and a much wiser Brittany, stood together, no longer afraid. Sarah stood at the podium, no longer in oversized scrubs, but in a simple, elegant dress. Her hands still had their faint tremor, but no one saw it as a weakness anymore. They saw it as a badge of honor. "A title on a door doesn't give you power," she said, her voice clear and strong, carrying across the silent, respectful crowd. "Authority isn't granted by a board. It's earned through the trust of your patients and your team. This center is named after a nurse, not because of me, but as a promise. A promise that from this day forward, in this hospital, the person doing the work matters more than the person with the title. A promise that if you have to break a rule to save a life, you do it. The patient always, always comes first." After the applause died down, a young rookie nurse approached her, her eyes wide with awe. "Colonel Miller, ma'am, do you have any advice?" Sarah looked at the young woman and saw a flicker of her younger self. She smiled, a genuine, warm smile. "Just protect your patients," she said, placing a hand on the rookie's shoulder. "And don't ever let anyone tell you that you're just a nurse. I'll have your back." She had found her peace, not in anonymity, but in the quiet, fierce dignity of a warrior who had finally come home. And that is how Sarah Miller went from fired and humiliated to a national hero. in less than an hour. The story of Sarah is a reminder that true heroism often goes unnoticed until the moment it becomes absolutely necessary. In a world obsessed with titles, status, and bureaucracy, it's easy to forget that the most important people in the room are often the ones doing the actual work. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button right now. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss these incredible stories of justice. And share this with someone who needs to be reminded. Never judge a book by its cover, and never ever underestimate a nurse. Comment below with your thoughts on Dr. Sterling's fate. Thanks for watching.